So now that we have our airplane starting at the right and moving up to the center and going to the left, you can see this by pressing the little play button, or by pressing the enter key on your keyboard, or by going to Control Enter, which generates a SWF file for you. You can see that the airplane is moving much more smoothly than it was before once we've added to that particular layer what's called a classic tween, and you'll see it in the lower left corner as having a solid arrow with a purple background. Alright, the text takeoff and landing are not actually displaying for the whole duration of the animation. Understandably, at frame 1 it exists with the black dot in that frame, and at frame 2 it disappears because it no longer exists. So what we want to do is go to frame 30 and insert a good old plain frame. To do this, you can press the F5 key, and likewise we're going to go to the landing layer, and to insert it in a different fashion you can right click on this new frame that you've got selected and choose Insert Frame. The biggest difference between what we did with the airplane is that when you insert a keyframe, it gives you the black dot in the actual layered keyframe location, and it basically is telling both Flash and you that a change is going to take place, whereas with the text there's no change taking place. Along with the diagram in the background, no changes taking place, as well as the background picture itself, no changes taking place. So therefore these just have them terminating with a frame, whereas the airplane layer, as I'd said, is a keyframe. The next thing we're going to do is create ourselves another layer. I'm going to click on the diagram layer so that way I can create my shadow layer just above it. So when I click on the new layer that I just created, and again I created the new layer by clicking on the new layer button in the lower left corner down at the bottom left of the timeline panel, this is going to be called my shadow. Okay. So you'll notice that whenever you create a new layer, in the far left side at frame 1 you're going to have a blank O, which basically is the same as doing a blank keyframe. The reason why you get that blank keyframe is because in order for Flash to add anything to a particular layer at a particular location, you have to have a frame that is willing to accept something. So simply clicking at, let's say, frame 50 and then trying to come over here and dragging, dropping the sun into place, it's not going to do it at frame 50. It's going to snap back to that first blank keyframe, which happened to be at frame 1. So the blank keyframe is where that particular layer is going to accept something else from either you drawing it or from the library symbols over here. So on the shadow layer, going back to where we were at, I'm going to click on frame 1 in the shadow layer, and you'll notice that a shadow exists in our library. So I'm going to click and drag that shadow and put it underneath our airplane over here on the far right side. It's a pretty large shadow, okay, so I'm going to scale it down a little bit. I'm going to hold down the Shift key while I drag it. Now this is using the free transform tool. This happens to be the third icon on the right hand side, okay. So the shadow is going to exist over here at the far right side. Now this time, instead of us keying at frame 15 that we're going to do an exact position over here and do what's called a classic tween, this time what we're going to do is we are going to right click anywhere inside of our shadow layer and insert a create motion tween. Okay, visually you're going to see a difference right away. The biggest difference is that the motion tween has a blue background and then the classic tween is a purple background. Alright, there's no arrows appearing at this time because as of right now no changes have taken effect. So I'm going to click at frame 15, and basically I'm looking to have this new shadow appear down here in the lower portion of the screen. So I'm just going to click and drag it down there. And you're going to see as soon as you clicked on frame 15 of the layer and then dragged the shadow airplane to that location on your timeline, let's click off a little bit here, you'll see that there's a diamond located at frame 15 of the shadow layer. And this basically is one of the more visual differences between a classic tween, that's the purple background, and the motion tween, which is located on the shadow layer. As I had said, it's just going to show you where there's slight placement changes taking place. You'll also notice at the very end, we don't terminate a motion tween with one of these rectangular boxes. It's kind of a newer version or newer beast that became available with CS4 and CS5 and obviously with CS6. So nonetheless, at frame 15, we've got the shadow in the opposite location of the airplane. So then when we want to terminate it over here on the far left side under landing, I'm going to click once at frame 30 of the shadow layer first. Then using my selection arrow, I'm just going to drag this up underneath the airplane so that way it has a landing zone there. If I press the play key or the enter key, you're going to see the actual animation taking place. And while it looks really great, there's a few different things we can do with this. At frame 15, it's pretty much a large airplane still, whereas if the airplane truly is going in the air, the shadow still exists, but it actually gets kind of smaller, and possibly we want to tweak with the alpha on it so it disappears a little bit more. So those are the steps we're going to go through at this time. First and foremost, the alpha. All right, so at frame 1 of the shadow layer, I'm going to click on the Property Inspector, and just to point out, I clicked on frame 1 of the shadow layer, turn the Property Inspector. You can see what's located over here is going to give us information in regards to this airplane. So click on your airplane shadow and you'll see that it will update the Property Inspector so that way we can see the alpha. Now, as you recall from last chapter, we want to make sure that our alpha is dragged all the way to 100% because obviously the airplane's just above the ground and we can still see it in full. Then at frame 15, we're going to make it so that way the airplane is not so bright. So once again, notice that the information over here in the Prop Inspector is not specific to the airplane shadow as we were hoping. You have to click on that airplane shadow for it then to update it to show us the color effect that we were looking for. So we're going to drag our color effect down to, let's say 40% or in the whereabouts of. Doesn't have to be exact, just drag a little bit so that way you can see that part of the shadow is going to obviously disappear off or dissipate. And notice that if I go to frame 30 of it, the shadow still stays the same because we haven't modified it to go back to the way it was. The way Flash works is a progressionary change. So over here on the far right side by takeoff, the alpha was set to 100%. At frame 15 halfway through, we set it to 40%. And because we didn't change it back at frame 30, it's going to maintain that 40%. So far, so good, I hope. So we have a couple ways of changing this. One is to, again, go to frame 30 of the shadow layer, click on the shadow itself, and modify the alpha back to 100%. Totally doable. Another way of doing this is to introduce you to a different method. On the Motion Editor tab, which is to the right of the timeline, I've got my shadow layer still selected. As you'll notice, the shadow layer is selected. When I click on the Motion Editor, it's a pretty small window down here. You can always drag this up to make it a little bit bigger if needed. But basically, you're going to see that the Motion Editor, again, is a newer tool, CS4, CS5. You'll see that there's all these different cool things that we can do to our objects, including placement of objects, the alpha of the object. We saw up here we can skew an object to give it a stretch or a pull. So I would like to focus in on the alpha side of things. You'll notice that when we are at frame 30, I'm going to drag that red scrubber to frame 30. When I click on this right here, it's set to, the alpha amount is set to 39, which is basically what I landed on. So at frame, I'm sorry, that was at frame 15. So at frame 30, nothing else is occurring, telling it to go back to 100%. So what we're going to do is move that red scrubber over to frame 30. And we're going to drag this back up to 100% or maybe a little bit less. Okay? Hopefully that's making sense so far. In addition, we're also going to change the size of our airplane at frame 15. It could stand to be a little bit smaller. Okay? So we could modify the size of that shadow at frame 50 by dragging your scrubber, the red scrubber, to frame 15. And if we set this a little bit smaller on the X, a little smaller on the Y, I should have set up to lock, but I didn't. There we go. Same idea. If you set these up to lock, then they're going to be exactly the same between the two. Alright, so now we can see that the airplane got smaller at frame 15, and then hopefully at frame 30, oh, it never got big again. And the reason again is because what we're doing is we've got it set at frame 1, and you can see the solid line exists here. And at frame 15, when we make the change, Flash isn't going to say, oh, okay, you made a change there, but I'm going to go back to the original way, because maybe you want to keep it small at that point. Unfortunately, we don't. As you saw, at frame 1, it was set to 60%. And the reason for this, to remind you, when we first entered or dragged the shadow effect into the scene, we also went into the free transform tool and I shift-clicked the corner to make it smaller. So your value, if you're going through the same file, may not be set to 60%. That's where mine was at. So when I go to frame 30, I likewise am going to make sure that these are locked and then increase this up to 60% once again. And then it'll go back to being its original size. So I'm going to click back on timeline and press the enter key so that way you can kind of see what we've created so far. And it's zooming in and zooming out, and that airplane is going up and down while the shadow's going the opposite direction. Alright, other things we can do to this shadow. You'll notice with your selection arrow selected, we've got the shadow layer selected, and with that, it's going to obviously automatically highlight the shadow itself. However, just like we did with the fish project from a couple chapters ago, if you hover over the line, you're going to get a curvy line there. So we can click and drag this to make it a little bit more loftier or smoother transition between the takeoff and the landing. Maybe you want it to be a little bit more stiffer of a landing. We can increase it in that direction. Okay. So remember that these features are still available to you as you go throughout your animation process.